There. Bottom of the list, one thumb up. This will be the last one for the day. How do we get justice? Simon Eddy. How do we get justice? Simon, that is a profound question. That is a very, very extremely good question. That's one of the memorable, and I don't want an email with your thoughts organized. I really don't, honestly. I'll just tell you right now, I'm not going to read it. So, how do we get justice? I think that's a superb question, and I think the answer to that question, I think, is to understand and explain that justice is always, 100% of the time, it is an individual result. It is a result based on the individual who has been harmed. Social justice is injustice by definition. And if you look at what the social justice warriors want, they want to penalize people who never held slaves and take away their money and give it to people who never were slaves. There's no such thing as social justice. If a person held slaves and those slaves were alive and that person had a fortune based on those slaves, then making the case for reparations to the slaves from the person that owned the slaves is a very strong argument to make. I think it's a slam dunk argument. But even then, if they owned them legally at the time, you can't fault somebody for not breaking the law. So justice is the ability for people to get an outcome that a decent morality suggests that they should get. In an ideal world, you would be able to punish a murderer to the degree that he would be able to bring the person back to life again. But we don't live in that world. That's not possible. Somebody's been murdered or raped. There is no justice available on the level commensurate to the loss. It just doesn't, it cannot be made right. You can go as far as you can go, but you can't go any further than that. Now, in the case of murder and rape, but let's just stay with murder, what is justice? Justice would be the return of the person to what was taken from them. If every time we caught a criminal and we got all of the stolen goods and returned them to the people who they were stolen from, including the cost of the repairs to breaking in the house and the rest of it, you could say that justice has actually been served to some degree, that the situation has been made as right as it could be made within the power of human agencies. But you can't do that in the case of a murder. So what does justice look like in the case of a murder? And the reason I bring this up is to say that if somebody murders somebody else, I don't think there is justice possible. In the deepest meaning of the word, I don't think it's possible. And that's just something you have to accept. So what can you do? In the case of murder, you can say that since this person cannot be brought back, since we can't adjust that end of the pan, we are going to have to do something of enormous consequence to the person who did it. That person is not able to provide justice. You can't get blood from a stone. But you can certainly punish them to the degree that you're able. And depending on the circumstances of that murder, I think you do have a moral right, in fact, maybe even an obligation to remove them from the planet. And for me, personally, who's been known to be hot-headed, although not quite that hot-headed, to me, the kind of thing that makes a difference between life imprisonment for murder and the death penalty has to do with remorse, and specifically has to do with a clear lack of remorse, showboating about it. Yeah, I notice I'm a jerk when I disagree with you. So that's where you are. When I hear about guys like, I forget his name, but football, the guy, one of the guys that was a champion of the left, he's being unfairly executed because he wrote a children's book. You find out that this guy in prison was mocking the people. He was doing a pantomime of them begging for their lives and laughing about it. And they got down on their knees and they asked this, and they were crying, and they said, "Oh, please help me, don't shoot me, please." That kind of thing. I'm sorry. That is beyond redemption for me. Conversely, people who have, there are some people who've committed murders who instantly, sincerely and genuinely regret it. That's, I think, what the difference is. And that's what I think justice is about. So the most important point is, Simon, is that it is an individual transaction. Individuals are harmed. You can make the case that groups are harmed. The Jews were certainly harmed by the Nazis, and those are two groups of people. But even then, I think you have to look at each individual case and ask yourself, what can we do to make this right? What can we do? And in most cases, we cannot make it right. So the question becomes, what can we do to make it as right as we can? Remorse goes a long way with me. Genuine remorse goes a long way with me. We're creatures that have been, that are capable of astonishing acts of goodness and astonishing acts of badness, and that's the way we're built. And my largest reserves of compassion for the offender, the victim always has my compassion, but the largest reserves of compassion I have are for criminals who are clearly overcome with remorse for what they did. And the reason this is important to me is because when you see people that are genuinely filled with actual remorse over some horrendous crime they've committed, that is telling me that the person who is experiencing the remorse is probably the real person. That you can't be enraged enough to kill somebody and be remorseful and have those two things live in you at the same time. You can have one, you can have the other. But a person who's a cold-blooded killer never feels remorse. Actual genuine psychopaths feel no remorse at all. It's a clinical discussion for them. Where are the bodies? Well, here's where you can find them. And I think it was 219, it might have been 218, I'm not sure. They feel no remorse. They're psychopaths. They just don't have the experience of the emotions. They don't feel it, and that's all there is to it. When you run into a person who's committed some heinous crime and they are genuinely filled with remorse, then I think that figures in on the justice. And I guess the close on this will be to say there is, in my mind, a pretty compelling case for, I almost said slavery, really. If I kill somebody, intentionally first-degree murder somebody, in my moral structure, that person has essentially forfeited their own life. And you could say that person could be put to death, and I think in cases, like I said, especially of profound lack of remorse, have a nice trip. But in the world of justice, you may not get perfect justice, but you may get closer to justice. And I guess what I'm dancing around here is the idea that if a murderer commits a murder, I think that murderer should be given a chance to basically spend the rest of their lives, or until the point that they're forgiven, by the people surviving the one that they harmed. In other words, if it turns out that that somebody's killed and you have a person who can work or make money and send that money to the family of the murdered party, I think that's pretty compelling. And you know, the sad thing about this, the reason this whole thing's a little sad, Simon, is that justice is something that every decent person not only strives for but lives by. That most people in this country, virtually everybody, is filled with a sense of justice and decency and morality. And we all want justice. I think the thing that's so sad about it is when you strip away all the bark, you begin to realize just how far away justice is, especially in the cases of harm or death to individual people. Social justice, as I said, is a series of groupings that form a new injustice. It's unjust to make me pay money to somebody else who was never a slave and I never held slaves. That's not justice. It's injustice. It's nothing like justice. It's individual injustice. But justice does mean a recognition of the fact that that prejudice has existed and that damage has been done. So I think in that case, justice comes down to making sure that we use whatever powers we have on this earth to make sure that the playing field is legally leveled, not morally leveled, because we can't legislate people's morality. You can't whip virtue into somebody. You just can't. If you could, then the Sharia countries would be the nicest place in the world to live. You can't whip it into people. But you can say, these are the rules of behavior in public spaces, and you will be expected to live up to them. And that's something you can actually achieve, I think. Bill, the Normans inflicted terrible injustice to your Saxon ancestors, also had Norman ancestors, I'm pretty sure. What are you owed? I'm not owed anything. I'm not owed anything by anybody. I think that is the most important thing when you get to justice is the sense of physical harm, not emotional discomfort. I'm not entitled to compensation for having my feelings hurt by what somebody said. That's not harm. That's just not. That is I think the fundamental, that's where the transom is. Because if it comes down to being, if it comes down to having your feelings hurt is a crime, then everybody's guilty and there is no freedom anywhere. So that's that. All right, I think that'll do it for the special Thursday edition of the Stratosphere Lounge, brought to you by the paying members at BillWhittle.com, to whom I am eternally grateful. And as usual, thank you to all of them. And we will see you guys. Well, let's bring up the schedule, why don't we? I hate to say we'll see you next Wednesday when we won't. But it looks like we will. Yes. That'll be Yom Kippur. Maybe we'll do a Yom Kippur special edition. All right, that's it for the Stratosphere Lounge. Again, thank you very much for joining us. We'll say goodbye to our YouTube friends. So goodbye, YouTube friends.